Hello, hi there. So it's time for the next installment of The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. Enjoy the randomness of me fooling around as I read you the next part of the book. Last time she fell down the side of the hill and got stung by a whole bunch of wasps. Poor Trisha. So let's continue on. Her back felt all scraped up, and her left arm, which had absorbed most of the damage during the final part of her slide, was a net of blood from wrist to elbow. The side of her face where the stump of branch had poked her was bleeding again, too. Not fair, she thought. Then a terrible idea occurred to her. Except it was more than an idea, it was a certainty. Her Walkman was broken, shattered to a million pieces in its little side pocket. Had to be. There's no way it could have survived the slide. Trisha tugged the pack's buckles with blood-streaked, trembling fingers, and at last worked the straps free. She pulled out her Game Boy, and that was smashed all right. Nothing left of the window where the little electronic blips had gambled, but a few shards of yellow glass. Also, her bag of potato chips had burst open, and the Game Boy's cracked white housing was covered with greasy crumbs. Both plastic bottles, the one with the water in it and the bottle of Surge, were dented but whole. Her lunch sack was smooshed into something that looked like roadkill, and covered with more potato chips. Patricia didn't even bother looking inside. My Walkman, she thought, unaware that she was sobbing as she unzipped the inner pocket. My poor, poor Walkman. To be separated from even the voices of the human world seemed more than she could bear on top of everything else. Trisha reached into the pocket and pulled out a miracle. The Walkman, intact! The earphone cord, which she had rewrapped neatly around the little gadget's body, had come loose in a tangle, but that was all. She held the Walkman in her hand, looking incredulously from it to the Game Boy lying beside her. How could one be whole and the other so badly shattered? How was that possible? It's not, the cold and hateful voice in her head informed her. It looks all right, but it's broken inside. Trisha straightened the cord, slipped the earbuds into place, and settled her finger on the power button. She had forgotten the stings, the insect bites, the cuts and scrapes. She closed her swollen, heavy eyelids, making a little dark. Please, God, she said into it, don't let my Walkman be broken. Then she pushed the power button. This just in, said the female announcer. She might have been broadcasting from the middle of Trisha's head. A Stanford woman hiking a Castle County section of the Appalachian Trail with her 2 children has reported her daughter, 9-year-old Patricia McFarland, missing and presumably lost in the woods west of TR-90 and the town of Moughton. Trisha's eyes flew wide open, and she listened for the next 10 minutes, long after WCS had reverted, like someone with unbreakable bad habits, to country music and NASCAR reports. She was lost in the woods. It was official. Soon they would swing into action, whoever they were, the people she supposed who kept the helicopters ready to fly and the bloodhounds ready to sniff. Her mother would be scared to death. And yet Trisha felt a small, strange trickle of satisfaction when she considered that likelihood. I wasn't supervised, she thought, not without self-righteousness. I'm just a little kid and I wasn't properly supervised. Also, if she gives me hell, I'll just say you wouldn't stop arguing, and finally I couldn't stand it anymore. Pepsi would like that. It was just so V.C. Andrews. At last she turned the Walkman off, rewrapped the headphone wire, gave the black plastic case a perfectly unself-conscious smooch, and tucked it lovingly back into its pocket. She eyed the mashed-up lunch bag and decided she couldn't bring herself to look inside and see what shape the tuna sandwich and the remaining Twinkie might be in. Too depressing. A good thing she'd eaten her egg before it could turn into egg salad. That thought probably deserved a giggle, but there was apparently no giggles in her. The old giggle well which her mother believed inexhaustible, seemed to have temporarily gone dry. Trisha sat on the bank of the little stream, which was less than 3 feet across here, and disconsolately ate potato chips, first out of the burst chip bag, and then plucking them off her lunch sack, and finally dredging the smallest fragments out of the bottom of her pack. A big bug droned past her nose, and she cringed from it, crying out and raising a hand to protect her face. But it was only a horsefly. At last, moving as wearily as a woman of 60 after a hard day's work, she felt like a woman of 60 after a hard day's work. Trisha replaced everything in her pack, even the shattered Game Boy went back in, and stood up. Before rebuckling the flap, she took off her poncho and held it up in front of her. The flimsy thing hadn't been any protection in her slide down the slope, and now it was torn and flapping in a way she would have considered comic under other circumstances. It looked almost like a blue plastic hula skirt, but she supposed she'd better keep it. If nothing else, it might protect her from the bugs, which had reformed their cloud around her hapless head. The mosquitoes were thicker than ever, no doubt drawn by the blood on her arms. They probably smelled it. Yugg, Trisha said, wrinkling her nose and waving her cap at the cloud of bugs. How gross is that? She tried to tell herself she ought to be grateful she hadn't broken her arm or fractured her skull. Also grateful that she wasn't allergic to stings like Mrs. Thomas's friend Frank. But it was hard to be grateful when you were scared, scratched, swollen, and generally banged up. She was putting the rags of her poncho back on. The pack would come next. When she looked at the stream and noticed how muddy the banks were just above the water, she dropped to one knee, wincing as the waist of her jeans chafed against the wasp stings above her hip, and took up a fingerful of the pasty brown-gray gluck. Try it or not? Well, what can it hurt? She asked with a little sigh, and dabbed the mud on the swelling above her hip. It was blessedly cool, and the itchy pain diminished almost at once. Working carefully, she dabbed mud on as many of the stings as she could reach, including the one which had puffed up beside her eye. Then she wiped her hands on her jeans, both hands and jeans considerably more battered now than they had been 6 hours ago, donned her torn poncho, then shrugged into her pack. Luckily, it lay without rubbing against any of the places where she'd been stung. Trisha began walking beside the stream again, and 5 minutes later she re-entered the woods. She followed the stream for the next 4 hours or so, hearing nothing but twitting birds and the ceaseless drone of bugs. It drizzled for most of that time, and once it showered hard enough to wet her through again, even though she took shelter under the biggest tree she could find. At least there was no thunder and lightning with the second downpour. Trisha had never felt as much like a town girl as she did while that miserable, terrifying day was winding down toward dark. The woods came in clinches, it seemed to her. For a while she would walk through great old stands of pine, and there the forest seemed almost all right, like the woods in a Disney cartoon. Then one of those clinches would come, and she would find herself struggling through snarly clumps of scrubby trees and thick bushes, all too many of the latter the kind with thorns, fighting past interlaced branches that clawed for her arms and eyes. Their only purpose seemed to be obstruction, and as mere tiredness slipped toward exhaustion, Trisha began to impute them with actual intelligence, a sly and hurtful awareness of the outsider in the ragged blue poncho. It began to seem to her that their desire to scratch her, to perhaps even get lucky and poke out one of her eyes, was actually secondary. What the bushes really wanted was to shunt her away from the brook, her path to other people, her ticket out. Trisha was willing to lose sight of the brook if the clenches of trees and tangles of bushes near it got too thick, but she refused to leave the sound of it. If the brook's low babble got too thin, she'd drop to her hands and knees and crawl under the worst of the branches, rather than sliding along them and looking for a hole. Crawling over the squelchy ground was the worst part. In the pine groves the ground was dry and nicely carpeted with needles. In the clinchy tangles it was always seemed wet. Her pack dragged through the lacings of branches and bushes, sometimes actually getting stuck. And all the time, no matter how thick the going, the cloud of minges and no-see-ums hung and danced in front of her face. She understood what made all of this so bad, so dispiriting, but could not articulate it. It had something to do with all the things she couldn't name. Some stuff she knew because her mother had told her: the birches, the beeches, the alders, the spruces and pines, the hollow hammering of a woodpecker, and the harsh cawing cry of the crows, the creaky door sound of the crickets as the day began to darken. But what was everything else? If her mother had told her, Trisha no longer remembered, but she didn't think her mother had told her in the first place. She thought her mother was really just a town girl from Massachusetts who had lived in Maine for a while, liked to walk in the woods, and had read a few nature guides. What, for instance, were the thick bushes with the shiny green leaves? Sorry, pages stuck together. Please, God, not poison oak. Or the small, trashy-looking trees with the dusty gray trunks. Or the ones with the narrow hanging leaves. The woods around Sanford, the woods her mother knew and walked, sometimes with Trisha and sometimes alone, were toy woods. These were not toy woods. Trisha tried to imagine hundreds of searchers flooding toward her. Her imagination was good, and at first she was able to do this quite easily. She saw big yellow school buses with the words Charter Search Party in the destination windows pulling into parking areas all along the western Maine part of the Appalachian Trail. The doors opened and out spilled the men in brown uniforms, some with dogs on chains, all with walkie-talkies clipped to their belts. A special few with those battery-powered loudhailers. These would be what she heard first. Big, amplified God voices calling,
Patricia McFarland, where are you? If you hear, come to the sound of my voice.
But as the shadows in the woods thickened and joined hands, there was only the sound of the stream, no wider and no smaller than when she had tumbled down the slope beside it, and the sound of her own breathing. Her mental pictures of the men in the brown uniforms weakened, little by little. I can't stay out here all night, she thought. No one can expect me to stay out here all night. She felt panic trying to grab her again. It was speeding her heartbeat, drying out her mouth, making her eyes throb in their sockets. She was lost in the woods, hemmed in by trees for which she had no name, alone in a place where her town girl vocabulary had little use, and she was consequently left with just a narrow range of recognition and reaction, all of it primitive. From town girl to cave girl in one easy step. She was afraid of the dark even when she was at home in her room, with the glow from the streetlight on the corner falling in through the window. She thought that if she had to spend the night out here, she would die of terror. Part of her wanted to run. Never mind how flowing water was bound to take her to people eventually. All that was likely just a crock of Little House on the Prairie shit. She had been following this stream for miles now, and all it had brought her to was more bugs. She wanted to run away from it, run in whatever direction the going was easiest. Run and find people before it got dark. That was the idea. That the idea was totally nutso didn't help much. It certainly didn't change the throb in her eyes, and the stung places. Now they were throbbing too. Or it eased the coppery fear taste in her mouth. Trisha fought her way through a tangle of trees growing so close together they were almost intertwined, and came out in a little crescent of clearing where the brook took an elbow bend to the left. This crescent, hemmed in on all sides by bushes and raggedy clumps of trees, looked like a little patch of Eden to Trisha. There was even a fallen tree trunk for a bench. She went to it, sat down, closed her eyes, and tried to pray for rescue. Asking God to not let her Walkman be broken. Asking God to not let her Walkman be broken had been easy because it had been unthinking. Now, however, praying was hard. Neither of her parents were churchgoers. Her mom was a lapsed Catholic, and her dad, so far as Trisha knew, had never had anything to lapse from. And now she discovered herself lost and without vocabulary in another way. She said the Our Father, and it came out of her mouth sounding flat and uncomforting. About as useful as an electric can opener would have been out here. She opened her eyes and looked around the little clearing, seeing all too well how gray the air was becoming, clasping her scratched hands nervously together. She couldn't remember ever discussing spiritual matters with her mother, but she had asked her father not a month ago if he believed in God. They had been out behind his little place in Malden, eating ice cream cones from the Sunny Treat man, who still came by in his tinkling white truck. Thinking of the Sunny Treat truck now made Trisha feel like crying again. Pete had been down the park, as they said in Malden, goofing with his old friends. God, Dad had said, seeming to taste the word like some new ice cream flavor. Vanilla with God instead of vanilla with Jimmy's. What brought that on, sugar? She shook her head, not knowing. Now, sitting on the fallen trunk in this cloudy, buggy June dusk, a frightening idea bloomed. What if she had asked because some deep, future-seeing part of her had known that this was going to happen? Had decided she was going to need a little God to get through, and had sent up a flare. God, Larry McFarland had said, licking his ice cream. God. Now, God, he thought a while longer. Trisha had sat quietly on her side of the picnic table, looking out at his little yard. It needed mowing, giving him all the time he needed. At last he said, I'll tell you what I believe in. I believe in a Subaudible. The what? She looked at him, not sure if he was joking or not. He didn't look as if he was joking. The Subaudible. Do you remember when we lived on 4th Street? Of course she remembered the house on 4th Street, 3 blocks from where they were, near the Lynn town line. A bigger house than this, with a bigger backyard that Dad had always kept mown. Back when Sanford was just for grandparents and summer vacations, and Pepe Robichaud was just her summer friend, and arm farts were the funniest things in the universe. Except, of course, for real farts. On 4th Street, the kitchen didn't smell of stale beer the way this house's kitchen did. She nodded, remembering very well. It had electric heat, that house. Do you remember how the baseboard units would hum, even when they weren't heating? Even in the summer? Trisha had shaken her head, and her father had nodded his, as if that was what he expected. That's because you got used to it, I said. But take my word, Trish. That sound was always there. Even in a house where there aren't baseboard heaters, there are noises. The fridge goes on and off, the pipes thunk, the floors creak, the traffic goes by outside. We hear those things all the time, so most of the time we don't hear them at all. They become, and he gestured for her to finish, as he had done since she was very small, sitting on his lap and beginning to read, his old dear gesture. Subaudible? She said, not because she completely understood what the word meant, but because it was so clearly what he wanted from her. Precisely, he said, gesturing once more with his ice cream. A splatter of vanilla drops ran up one leg of his khaki pants, and she found herself wondering how many beers he'd had already that day. Precisely, sugar. Subaudible. I don't believe in any actual thinking God that marks the fall of every bird in Australia or every bug in India, a God that records all of our sins in a big golden book and judges us when we die. I don't want to believe in a God who would deliberately create bad people and then deliberately send them to roast in a hell he created. But I believe there has to be something. He had looked around the yard with its too high, too patchy grass, the little swinging gym set he had set up for his son and daughter. Pete had outgrown it, and Trisha really had too, although she still swung or would go down the slide a few times when she was here, just to please him. The two lawn dwarves, one barely visible in an extravagant splurge of spring weeds. The fence at the very rear that needed painting. In that moment he had looked old to her. A little confused, a little frightened, a little lost in the woods, she thought now, sitting on that fallen log with her pack between her sneakers. Then he had nodded and looked back at her. Yeah, something. Some kind of insensate force for the good. Insensate. Do you know what that means? She had nodded, not knowing exactly, but not wanting him to stop and explain. She didn't want him to teach her, not today. Today she only wanted to learn from him. I think there's a force that keeps drunken teenagers, most drunken teenagers, from crashing their cars when they're coming home from the senior prom or their first big rock concert. That keeps most planes from crashing even when something goes wrong. Not all, just most. Hey, the fact that no one's used a nuclear weapon on actual living people since 1945 suggests there has to be something on our side. Sooner or later, someone will, of course, but over half a century. That's a long time. He had paused, looked out at the lawn dwarves with their vacant, cheery faces. There's something that keeps most of us from dying in our sleep. No perfect, loving, all-seeing God. I don't think the evidence supports that, but a force. The Subaudible. You got it. She had gotten it, but hadn't liked it. It was too much like getting a letter you thought would be interesting and important. Only when you opened it, it was addressed to a dear occupant. Do you believe in anything else, Dad? Oh, the usual. Death and taxes, and that you're the most beautiful girl in the world. Dad! She laughed and wriggled as he hugged her and kissed the top of her head, liking his touch and his kiss, but not the smell of beer on his breath. He let her go and stood up. I also believe it's beer o'clock. You want some iced tea? No thanks, she said, and perhaps something... I don't know what the word is. Prescient had been at work, because as he started away, she said, Do you believe in anything else? Seriously. His smile had faded into a look of seriousness. He stood there thinking, sitting on the log she remembered, being flattered that he would think so hard on her behalf. His ice cream starting to drip over his hand now. Then he looked up, smiling again. I believe that your heartthrob Tom Gordon can save 40 games this year, he said. I believe that right now he's the best closer in the major leagues. That if he stays healthy and the Sox hitting holds up, he could be pitching in the World Series come October. Is that enough for you? Yes! She had cried, laughing, her own seriousness broken. Because Tom Gordon really was her heartthrob, and she loved her father for knowing it and for being sweet about it instead of mean. She had to run to him and hugged him hard, getting ice cream on her shirt and not caring. Oh, it was a little sunny treat between friends. And now, sitting here in the growing grayness, listening to the drip of water all around her in the woods, watching the trees blur into shapes which would soon become threatening, listening for amplified shouts.
Come to the sound of my voice.
Or the distant barking of dogs, she thought. I can't pray to the Subaudible. I just can't. She couldn't pray to Tom Gordon either. That would be ludicrous. But perhaps she could listen to him pitch. And against the Yankees at that. WCAS had their socks on. She could put hers on too. She had to conserve her batteries, she knew that. But she could listen for a while, couldn't she? And who could tell? She might hear those amplified voices and barking dogs before the game was over. Trisha opened her pack, reverently removed her Walkman from its inner pocket, and settled the earbuds into place. She hesitated a moment, suddenly sure the radio would no longer work, that some vital wire had been joggled loose in her tumble down the slope, and this time there would be only silence when she pushed the power button. It was a stupid idea, maybe, but on a day when so many things had gone wrong, it seemed like a horribly plausible idea, too. Go on, don't be chicken guts. She pushed the button, and like a miracle, her head filled with the sound of Jerry Trupiano's voice, and, more importantly, with the sounds of Fenway Park. She was sitting out here in the darkening, drippy woods, lost and alone, but she could hear 30,000 people. It was a miracle. Comes to the belt, Troop was saying. He winds, he fires, and... Strike 3 called. Martinez caught him looking. Oh, that was a slider, and it was a beaut. That caught the inside corner, and Bernie Williams was just frozen. Oh, my. And at the end of 2.5 innings, it's still the Yankees 2, the Boston Red Sox nothing. A singing voice instructed Trisha to call 1-800-54-GIANT for some sort of auto repair, but she didn't hear it. 2.5 innings already played, which meant it had to be 8 o'clock. At first it seemed amazing, and yet, given the faded quality of the light, not so hard to believe either. She'd been on her own for 10 hours. It seemed like forever. It also seemed like no time at all. Trisha waved at the bugs. This gesture was now so automatic she didn't even realize she was doing it, and then delved into her lunch bag. The tuna sandwich wasn't as bad as she had feared, flattened and torn into hunks, but was still recognizably a sandwich. The baggie had sort of kept it together. The remaining Twinkie, however, had turned into what Pepsi Robichaud would likely have called total sploosh. Trisha sat listening to the game and slowly ate half of her tuna sandwich. It awoke her appetite, and she easily could have gobbled the rest, but she put it back in the bag and ate the splooshed Twinkie instead, scooping up the moist cake and the nasty, tasty white cream filling. That stuff was always cream and never cream, Trisha mused. There's a spelling thingy. With one finger. When she'd gotten all she could with her fingers, she turned the paper inside out and licked it clean. Okay, so I'm running out of footage here that I have. And, yeah, we're still on Chapter 4. Like I said, Chapter 4 is a beast. It's super long. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed the randomness of the video and my reading, even though I messed up a few times. Love you guys. See you in the next one. Love you, love you, love you. Bye.